So what to do with the brushes? Well, there are a lot of different uses for the brushes that we just learned how to download and load into Photoshop. This is an adaptation using brushes to make this photo look like I painted it with watercolor on a piece of parchment or a piece of watercolor paper. So that's what we're going to learn how to do. And it basically works with any photo that you already have in your current body of work. The steps are basically the same. All you have to do is make some critical judgments about how to use the brushes. So let's get started. First thing you're going to need is you're going to need to have a photo selected that you want to work with, and you're going to need the parchment attachment that I have put out there for you to use. You have several to choose from. I selected this one. It doesn't really matter which one that you select, but you're going to need those two things open. Pause the video now and open those two things up. In addition to having those two files open, you're going to need to open a new Photoshop document. So I'm going to go File and New, and then I want it to be a horizontal orientation, so I'm going to make it 17 inches wide by 11 inches tall. If yours says something like that, change pixels to inches. It's just easier to deal with. I want my resolution to be 180, and I want the background to be white, and then I can click OK. So this is going to be my workspace. I'm going to pull it off so that it's not part of that group over here. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put a texture on this piece of paper that makes it look like canvas or a rough surface. So I'm going to go up to Layer and scroll down to New Fill Layer, and I'm going to click Solid Color. It'll ask me what I want to call it. I'm going to call it Canvas. Opens this dialog color. It asks me what color I want my canvas to be. Right now I just want it to stay white, so I'm going to leave that where it is. Click OK, and you'll see over here I've got a new layer. It's called Canvas, and then I've got this little deal indicating that I have canvas. It's still smooth though. I need to put a texture on it. So I'm going to go to Filter and down to Texture, and then down to Texturizer. When I open it, it'll say, yeah, you need to rasterize. Click OK, and it opens this box up, and it defaults into canvas. So I'm going to turn the size of the texture up a little bit just so I can see it. I'm going to turn the depth of the canvas up a little bit just so that it has a nice textured appearance. I can choose where the light's coming from. I think I'm going to keep it top left and click OK. Now my paper, if I zoom in, has that same texture. Zoom back out. Okay, so the next step in the process is I've got to get these two images that I was working with, the parchment and the photo, into my workspace. So I'm going to start with the parchment photo. It's opened up. I'm going to take my parchment photo, click on the image with the parchment on it. I've got to unlock the layer. Click OK. I'm going to make sure that Auto Select and Show Transform Control tools are on. That's going to give me the bounding box and allow me to resize it when I get it there. But I'm going to click and drag that over to here, and now I need to resize it. And I'm going to rotate it and zoom out a little bit, and then hold the Shift and Option key down, and that'll make it grow, and I can make it as big as I want it, and then hit OK, and there's my texture. So I've got my canvas layer and layer 1, the parchment layer. The next thing I want to do is bring the flower photo that I opened, and you can use whatever photo you want. I want to bring that flower photo into the parchment layer. So I'm going to click on the flower layer, bring it over, and now I have the photo on one layer and I have the parchment on another layer. I'm going to make this larger holding the shift key down, moving that around so that it fills that space. And I'm going to turn the parchment layer off for just a minute. I have to enter. Turn the parchment layer off because I want to add a filter to the flowers. I want to make them look more like they've been painted with watercolor paint. So I'm going to come up to filter and down to artistic and over to watercolor, and that should open a dialog box with the photo in it. And I'm going to zoom out, Command minus zooms out, and I've got some stuff I can play with. I can play with the amount of texture that's in my watercolor. It takes a minute for it to register. I don't particularly care for that. I'm going to move it back down where it was. I can turn the shadow intensity of the watercolor up. Makes it much darker. I don't particularly care for that either. But you can make a determination on your photo. I can turn the brush detail up, but by turning the brush detail up, it makes it look more photographic, and I like the fact that it looks more like a painting by having the brush detail turned down. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. So you can see out here on my workspace then I've got my photo looks very different than my painting. It's a lot more textured. So my first layer of the parchment, if it's not already on the top layer, go ahead and put it on the top layer. And you want to make sure that this layer descriptor is changed from normal to multiply. And what that's going to do is it's going to mean that you can see through the parchment. So I can see through the texture of the parchment, and it almost puts it on top of the watercolor, so it looks like the watercolor is part of the parchment texture. The next thing we want to do is kind of soften the edges of the photo so it looks like they've been loosely painted into the form of those flowers. So the next thing I'm going to do is come up to layer and new fill layer like I did before, solid color, click OK, and I want it to be white, and then I'm going to click OK, and I want the fill layer to be between layer 2 and layer 1, between my photo and the parchment. And right now you'll see that the photo's been completely obstructed. You can't see the flowers anymore. So we're going to get rid of some of this fill layer. I'm going to click on the little rectangle on the color fill layer 1, and I'm going to click on the brush. And then earlier I in the other tutorial showed you how to find all the brush options, and so when I open the brush options by clicking on this little folder next to the brush, I get all the list of brushes that I have to use, and I'm going to turn some of the settings on. So it defaults to this. I'm going to turn scattering on, and what scattering does, I can determine the number of brushes that I want to scatter amongst my page as I hold the button down. And I want to turn shape dynamics on. Shape dynamics on, it allows me to select the number of size differences. It rotates the brush automatically for me. It determines to what degree the brushes are bigger or smaller from one another as I slide this left and right. So I'm going to have it go from pretty tiny to much, much larger. That looks about right. And what that's going to allow me to do, when I click on color fill, I want to make sure that this is set to black. And then when I click one time, a portion of my painting will appear. And if I downsize my brush using the bracket key, if I click on another portion of the painting, a little bit more appears. And each time I click, a little bit more appears. But you can see I've got similar brush marks because I keep using the same brush. What I want to do is go back to brush tip shape, and every once in a while I want to change brushes, make sure I'm using some bigger brushes, some smaller brushes, and you can see that as I click it randomly scatters those brushes and changes the angle. And as I click more and more, it gets more and more defined. And so I'm going to focus on this white flower down here because that's kind of the focal point of the piece. And every so often I'm changing brushes. Make it a little bit smaller. So that's pretty dense, and everything on the outside is pretty light. But the thing that bothers me at this point are these hard edges of the photo. Well, I can fix that. I'm going to turn the scattering and the shape dynamics off so that I just get one brush at a time. And now to remove some of this, all I got to do is click, and I can rotate the brush. I've switched from the black that was here. When I lay it down, it's black, and when I pick it up, it's white. And so now I can chip away and soften the edges wherever I see the edge of the photo. I can even come out in the middle of the photo, and every once in a while, and if I don't like it, I can undo. If it's too dense, I can undo. And so it's just a give and take, back and forth, until you feel like you've made a painting that is, and I like where it's kind of dark and not dark there. And I'm just going to go back and forth, adding and subtracting, changing the size and changing the angle of things until I have a nice soft transition from the parchment to the painting. And you can hit pause and start to do that. Alright, so I'm happy with the way the flowers have turned out. I like the way that it's nice and soft, and I've got some really pretty well defined brush strokes in there, but the edges are very soft. But the color of the parchment has kind of really drastically changed the color of my photos, and I'm not super happy with that. And I'll show you what I mean. If I turn the parchment off, I like the texture of the parchment, but I much prefer the color to be a little bit cleaner, not quite so yellow of the parchment. So I'm going to work on that just a little bit. I'm going to switch to layer 1, and I'm going to command click so that I get marching ants around layer 1. You can see the marching ants out here. It means I've made a selection. And I'm going to take and make a photo filter layer, and instead of the orange that it defaults to, I'm going to come down and make it a blue photo filter. And what that does is it takes some of the yellow away. It filters the yellow light through the blue, and I'm going to turn the density of that filter up a little bit, and you'll see it starts to get a little cooler, and the color of the flower is a little better, not quite so orangey. So when I turn that off, you'll see I like the color of that a lot better than with the parchment showing through. That's totally an optional step. It may look great without that photo filter on whatever it is that you chose to do, but for me, it's gonna really help that. So I think I'm done with this. If you felt like this was too much additional space, you could always go back and crop it into a little bit different configuration. Like maybe this needs to be more trimmed with the crop tool, but that's entirely up to you. It's kind of a feel thing. I'm putting that flower on a third. I think I like that better. And now I've got a much stronger focal point and a lot less wasted space. So I'm done with my composition. I hope yours turns out well.